Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Countdown to Stonesaga, Episode 8, joined by Max and Luke. Hey, guys.
Hello.
Wonderful. Well, if you're joining us for the very first time, we have a big backlog of live streams. This is, I guess, the first live stream of 2023. Luke and Max are the designers of Stonesaga, published by Games. That's kind of where I come in, and we are gearing up for our Kickstarter launch, which is coming soon. We are, I just Googled it because I can't do math sometimes. We are 29 days away from the Kickstarter launch of Stonesaga. Excited? Happy?
Can't
Nervous?
believe it's this soon.
I know.
It's like the past, I don't even know how much time, 2 years? 2 years since something. It's been an incredible ride. We are thrilled to get into it. As you join us, as always, feel free to ask questions about what we're talking about, or not what we're talking about. Just as long as we're chatting Stonesaga, that's what we're doing. So, for the next month, every Monday, we are doing a stream. This is kind of a perfect time to ask your questions that you may have leading up to the Kickstarter launch. There's a few things that we won't be giving away probably until a launch, but hey, that's for another time. And then I think on launch day, we haven't announced this yet, but I believe Devin is doing kind of like a streaming festivity day where we may be jumping in and out of doing some Q&As or whatever, just watching the number tick up on Kickstarter, hopefully. And so that'll be fun to come. But before we get into this, so today, Max is just about to post a blog on the BGG Stonesaga page titled, Max, what's it titled?
Dynamic gameplay loops.
Boom. Sexiest topic of them all.
I know. It's very exciting. Not dry at all.
No. Okay. For those of you who play games, this is like some DGL, as Luke and I started calling it just recently, is kind of like the secret sauce that you don't necessarily know it's there, but you feel it when it's missing. Or you feel it when it's not as fleshed out as it should be. And so dynamic gameplay loops, we'll jump right into that, how they're kind of going into Stonesaga, all that fun stuff. But a couple housekeeping things. First of all, a massive thank you to everyone who has gone and clicked notify me on launch for the Stonesaga Kickstarter page. We are at 10,200? Let me just click.
Whoa, that's up
refresh.
From this morning.
Oh, we just gained 3 more people. 10,203. And so if you're wondering where you can find that link, I think it should be in the description below, or you can just type into Google Stonesaga Kickstarter. It'll take you right to this page. This is the best way to get notified on launch. If you haven't seen the trailer for the game yet, go watch it on YouTube. It is epic. Ori Kagan, he's responsible for making it great, him and the team. So hey, thank you, Ori, and thanks for joining us here on this live stream. For those of you who are unaware, the launch date is February 7th. That is on Kickstarter, and there's been a bunch of Taryn, our graphic designer / art director / photographer / whatever else is needed to make the games look pretty. Took a bunch of photos over the Christmas break, and then a bud of mine named Taylor Holloway from Creature Caster, and his side business is, I think, Zombie Studios. He painted these miniatures, which, wait, that wasn't a miniature. These are the miniatures. I don't know. They look great. I love painted miniatures, and especially people who paint them much better than I can ever do. We have the big, look at this game.
That
Man, it's such a good looking game.
That Primal Cave wall interior looks really good.
Yeah.
I love the way that came out.
Miniatures, we got our fishing activity, foraging, bunch of item cards. I don't know if this is a spoiler image. It kind of is. Just don't look too closely.
It doesn't show you how to make them on there.
Yeah, you're right. Our dual layer player boards, unpainted miniatures. So hey, a note for everyone who's watching this. We are actually going to give the snake guy on the left a base so that his elevation comes up to about the same height as the tree rock guy, just because we want them to be imposing, and it feels like it needs to be a little bit more imposing. Look at this; it's even snowing in the game.
Oh wow!
I wonder. I actually didn't ask Taryn if she took these when she was outside, but kind of like, oh, that's fantastic. So hey. If you want to look at some of the photos, you can go to the Board Game Geek page. We posted a bunch there. Join the Facebook community group, Discord, all that stuff people are posting. And you'll be noticing content from reviewers coming out. We sent about 10 copies to reviewers just before Christmas, and a bunch of them have been kind of opening it up. I think King of Average just posted an unboxing yesterday, so make sure to kind of go like that. One Stop Co-op Shop, they're doing live streams. I believe, are they scheduled on for tonight for a live stream? I think so, right? Yeah, so I think they were last Monday. And I believe that part 2, challenge 2, is tonight. So if you're wondering, hey, you can search into YouTube, One Stop Co-op Shop. I think they have 2 channels. They have their streaming channel and their other channel. Yes, it's at 8 p.m. Central, I believe, 6 p.m. Pacific. So that's my housekeeping. I think it's time to talk dynamic gameplay loops. Max, why don't you just, for us lay people out there, what are dynamic gameplay loops, and why are they important to a good game?
Oh, Max, you're muted.
And I'm muted. Sorry, the dog was snoring. She's still snoring, but hopefully I can talk over her. So dynamic gameplay loops are, it's a wider concept in games, but basically your gameplay loop is, sort of what do you do, over and over again within the game. What is the core ritual of things you do? And this is going to vary a lot game to game. And if your game plays really quickly, your gameplay loop might not actually be very dynamic at all. It might be just a few iterations that are kind of similar, building on each other in some ways. Whereas if your game is more complicated, there may be more, and goes on for longer, there's going to be more complexity to this. So a dynamic gameplay loop is essentially a gameplay loop that receives feedback from your earlier actions, and the loop adjusts itself accordingly. A ton of video games use this. A simple example is like in a survival crafting video game. Usually, when you harvest a resource in an area, you deplete that resource. So now suddenly you're pressured to explore more because you've run out of that key resource in that area. But it's a little different to put these into an analog game than a video game, because a video game can keep track of every tree in the game if it wants to. A board game, you can do that, but you may end up having to do a lot of writing and drawing and erasing and all that. So usually board games have some methods to sort of sidestep that, and we can talk a bit more about that later. But basically, for a survival crafting game, the core loop revolves around harvesting resources, building stuff with those resources, and then using whatever you built to access a new area where you get resources. Or that's sort of a broad term. There's a lot of ways that can be applied. It can be physically going to a new place. It can be, now you can dig through an old thing you couldn't so that you can get into a place you couldn't before. Or it might just be that you were unable to use a resource before, but now that you've built something, you can actually go back and use that resource that wasn't useful to you before. The classic, in a lot of survival crafting video games, that's the you have this metal ore, but until you have a way to melt it, you can't really do anything with it. We don't have metallurgy in Stonesaga, but we do have some similar things where until you have a certain technology or cultural, physical or cultural technology, something might be less useful to you or not useful to you at all. But then later, once you've built up more, it becomes useful. So the gameplay loop is in a survival crafting game is generally going around that circle, over and over again. And, ideally, it stays entertaining because there's a challenge to getting things, but when you have harvested things and you can build things, that makes harvesting easier, which in turn makes reaching new areas easier. But it can sort of become this spiral where as you're advancing, it is a loop. You're going around the same circuit over and over again, but you're moving outward a little bit every time. And eventually you'll hit the stability plateau. And that's where the game sort of plays itself. Now, some games do some really cool things with this.
Okay, just
sorry,
let's just no.
Yes.
That's good. I just want to take a breath before we. So just because I think stability plateau is a really interesting concept, and then how it kind of plays in the games. But before we get there, okay, big talk through what different dynamic gameplay loops, specifically kind of the survival crafting. What would be some maybe specific instances of that inside of Stonesaga? Like what are these loops that we have?
I can give an example.
Yeah.
There's one that's not this is hardly a spoiler. I'd say the most basic crafting and processing gameplay loop in Stonesaga is if you want a visual aid for this, on BGG, our earlier dev article was on crafting and processing materials.
Right.
So material tokens like certain kinds of stones, fiber, etc. You need some sort of processing icon to flip those to their other side, right? And then they become more useful or usable in crafting, etc. So one of the most basic loops in Stonesaga is that there's three types of stones. The sunstone, which is sort of a rough sandstone thing. The cloudstone, which is like a hard sort of granite stone you find in the mountains. And then riverstone, which is sort of like the softer flint that flakes and can be made sharp. But you need a strike icon to strike the flint and flip it over, which you can get on the process side of the cloudstone. By that cloudstone, first, you need a grinding icon to shape that stone into a shape you can hold and use. And that grinding icon is on the sunstone. So super basic would be, okay, if I get some sunstone, then I can process this cloudstone. Once I process this cloudstone, I can process this riverstone. When the riverstone is processed, it's sharp now. I can use that to process fiber, for example, cut it into more useful strips of fiber. In the picture right here, that stick needs a cutting icon and it needs a fire icon. So that's like one of the most basic loops of like, if I get this resource, I can process this resource. Once it's processed, I can process this other resource. So like that's like a little like micro loop that we're talking about.
Yeah. And that fits in nicely with the bigger loops too, because, as you, that sort of has a necessary, like self-sustaining element, because as you use up your resources, you'll need to go get more. So on the micro scale, that works really nicely because like you figure out how to make one thing and then you're like, oh, I wonder if I could have made a different tool by orienting the handle or the stone differently. So you go in there and you need to go get another wood and then process another thing. So that keeps you going in that loop nicely.
Okay, so so this is good. I think we're getting it. We're seeing it. There's a bunch of different avenues and loops that Stonesaga has, and then inevitably in a lot of these games we reach the stability plateau.
Yes. So
okay, go for it.
Yeah. So in Stonesaga, you might start to see that when this isn't too big a spoiler, you're going to build some structures, and a lot of structures will make it easier to do previous tasks. So it might be easier to gather food thanks to these structures, or store food, or it might be easier to do processing and crafting thanks to these structures. And this is sort of where the game starts to play itself a little bit. And the stability plateau is tricky because it's what the players are going to strive for, right? Because they want to figure out how to get things to run smoothly. But it also causes this problem of it can kind of, after you hit it, the game can feel sort of unfulfilling because it's not hard anymore. And some games really lean into this, especially some video games do some really cool stuff here. There are some games that kind of start at that point, like Factorio, which I've only played a little bit of, but that one is all about figuring like, okay, like the early, like harvest crafting stuff is not really the game. The game is really like, once you start to have a lot of stuff, how do you, like how do you figure out how to keep making the loop bigger and bigger for yourself? So there's some really interesting ideas to play in that. But in terms of the solutions that a board game can implement, it's a little more straightforward. So the major solutions you can take are you can have sort of reset points, points where the game essentially like pushes you off of the plateau forcefully by introducing new elements.
Yeah. So so I'm just thinking. I actually just played through Sleeping Gods on the weekend with my wife, and they kind of had like these different eras, but basically you had this event deck. It was 18 cards. When it ran out, it queued, it triggered like the next kind of thing. So you read some stuff, but then you actually removed some of these ability cards that you were gaining throughout. So you were powering up your characters by removing these ability cards, but there were certain like upgrades that were permanent. So it wasn't like a complete reset, but it was, so you actually had this, because otherwise I think the game would have just been too easy. There would have been no tension. And so that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Or like
one of the ways.
Yeah, in Stonesaga, that's epochs essentially.
Right.
And so basically that's sort of the same as the game ending when you hit the stability plateau, or each epoch isn't a full separate game, but you're doing a different thing. You have different challenges and goals. It's sort of it's a soft reset. You'll keep some things, as you were talking about exactly, and in Sleeping Gods, you'll keep some things, but other things are just sort of will be refreshed. And so like you're not back to square one, but the game moves ahead to the next area, and so it kind of helps things move on smoothly. But that's a very like heavy-handed way of dealing with the stability plateau, just shoving people off. And you don't want to do that too much. I'm guessing in Sleeping Gods that big reset probably only happens a couple times over the course of the game.
Yeah. And
it's same in Stonesaga. We've only got 3 epochs. So it's not like that's going to happen every game. So the other way you can handle this is by leveraging a dynamic loop. So making it so that the actions you take in one step of the loop apply changes to the next. So again, a classic example of this is, like if you harvest a lot of a type of resource, it might become depleted in an area. But that's a lot harder to track in a board game where you're just looking for whether the resource is on the board than a video game where it can keep track of every blade of grass if it wants to. So Stonesaga has a couple ways to do this, which, the concepts at the start of this were very complicated, but then I got into the details and I was like, this is pretty straightforward how this happens from a practical standpoint, which is that, we alter the decks. So you might complete a goal, and the goal might have you make a choice about something, how your people are going to live. Are you going to be more nomadic, or are you going to be more sedentary? And that in turn might add cards to the night deck or the discovery deck, or even change the forage decks. So suddenly the basic activities you're doing, the basic challenges you face have changed, and they can change in ways that will keep them interesting and push back more on you. So, like making a lot of progress in one respect, building a bunch of structures that makes the game easier for you in one way may have a consequence of introducing a way that the game becomes a little bit harder for you. So that's one, simple example. Another big example is the overlays. And this is one where, again, this one is actually very organic. Wherever you build your village, whatever you choose to build your outpost on top of, you no longer have access to. So if you decide to cut down a forest to build your village there, you don't have access to that forest anymore for foraging. Now, obviously, having an outpost is important. You'll want one. But that introduces sort of a natural consequence that makes things a little trickier. Now, you might have to go further afield to get the things you need, which pushes you to explore new areas, which causes you to run into new problems and challenges. And so we've the overlay system is really like a big way for us to manipulate that. And the board can throw overlays down too. The behemoths can add overlays, for instance, where they've been active and changed the terrain. And
right, each one has a layer, for example.
Exactly. And as we get past the beta, there's going to be even more of these too. In the beta, there's only 3 challenges, so there's only so much the gameplay loops can change. But this is something that we are very much implementing for the full game.
Yeah, and well, actually, sorry, Luke, go for it.
Oh, sure. Well, I think another way that Stonesaga keeps things interesting too is that there's a fair amount of adapting to your current situation. Obviously, I think the biggest way that Stonesaga pushes back on the players is the presence of the behemoth in the game. And there's fewer, sort of the tools you can make to sort of mitigate a lot of the survival aspects of the game. I can craft, a basket, and it lets me carry more, fruits and vegetables when I go foraging. So that's more efficient. Great. But, if there's a giant rock monster, a basket, that does nothing to help me there. So I think that's an area where the game pushes back. And there's other instances too, where, it's less so of a feedback loop and more of sort of an emerging sort of narrative of the game. So certainly there are examples, as Max was talking about, where you do a thing to the environment, and there's some sort of trigger in the game. Another good example would be, and this is in the beta that you can play, that how did you feed your tribe primarily? Was it through resources, plants that you gathered, or did you primarily do hunting? And when you complete a goal that required you to get food, it asks which it was, and depending on which it was, it triggers something and then leads you down a path. So that's a way where, you did a thing to the environment and the game is responding. But there's also instances where your input wasn't involved necessarily. A thing happens in the game, and this can be, you drew a rare discovery card and you stumbled into something, or, in a later epoch, there's an emergence of some sort of thing in the map you didn't expect. And in those situations, then you may have built up tools that would help you sort of in the normal survival crafting, sort of regular sort of gameplay loop. But then there's all of a sudden these other conditions impinging upon you that you have to figure out how to adapt to. So that keeps the game interesting in a lot of ways too. There's sort of some unexpected changes that happen.
Well, and speaking to those unexpected changes, a lot of the way we've tried to answer these questions goes back to that original idea of leaving your mark. Mm-hmm. And so, we want the gameplay loops to be dynamic, not just because that helps the longevity of the game, helps keep the things you're doing engaging, but also because it really fits the themes and fits with this idea that you are acting on the environment is acting on you. And so, these things are both in flux with each other at all times. And that's something feels really important about the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think probably one of the biggest kind of standouts for me when I think about Stonesaga, there's a lot of really neat elements like with exploration and discovery and these like kind of crafted-ish moments where it's like, okay, if you do this, then you have these choices and the challenges and the encounters and those types of things. But I think that the magic of Stonesaga is actually all of these different systems that have been built and then kind of like just how they interact. So it's like, yeah, there's these systems and these loops in and of themselves, but then there's a bunch of loops that like intersect with one another. Mm-hmm. In these ways, which create some dynamism, right? And something we haven't mentioned is like the unrest of your settlement, mm-hmm. right? If you choose to ignore your people and go off and explore, your people are going to get upset, and then there's going to be bad things that happen, which then adversely impact a different system, right? So we have these like loops, and then which is I think it's great for kind of like emergent stories, right? There's these different stories that people will be able to experience with the game, but how we each play the game and the marks that are we leave on our copy of Stonesaga, those are going to vary so much from person to person, session to session, and then play group to play group. So I love that bit about how these kind of dynamic gameplay loops are are looping in on one another to create something cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's definitely part of where Stonesaga sort of plays in a related but not exactly the same pool of being an immersive simulator, albeit a very abstract one.
Yeah.
But because Stonesaga records a lot of what has happened in the past, tries to record everything that is important, and gives players freedom to record stuff for their own, record that the game didn't necessarily care about. You can really create these long linked narratives. And one of the things that I expected to be, usually watching people play my games is really hard because every little thing sticks out to me. But I was actually really getting into the one-stop co-op shop playthrough with Stony McStoneface because of, as soon as I started watching it, Luke was watching at the same time, and Luke sent this message to me, oh, they're getting really into the emergent storytelling stuff. And I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And watching it, I really enjoyed it because they were telling such a different story than any of the ones we had told in our games.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating because that was the tutorial scenario. That's like the scenario where, in my mind, it's not fun anymore because it's like we've done it so many times, and it's like, okay, let's just get through it so we can get to like the good stuff. But it's like, oh yeah, there's like a lot of like fun moments even in that kind of intro tutorial scenario. It's great. Anything else that you guys want to add? I like, we've been chatting for roughly 30 minutes, but happy to kind of hear any parting thoughts on this topic.
No, I thought your comment earlier, Brendan, was apt. The idea of systems sort of existing on their own, but intersecting with each other to create interesting loops and, a sort of an emergent narrative. I mean, just a really, really basic example might be, oh, hey, my character needs some food and water. I'll go ahead and, move to this other location so that I can go fishing. Oh, I'm moving. I have to draw a discovery card. You draw a discovery card and it's like, oh no, you're being attacked by predators. You might be chased away to a different location. And it's like, oh, now I'm over here. And like, well, I can't go fishing here, but maybe I could go foraging, and, your plans change and that sort of thing. And just that little interaction between like the energy system where you need food and water, the, terrain system where I need to be at a location, with water to go fishing, and the deck of cards you draw from when you move. Just those three little elements together, systems on their own created this sort of emergent sort of mini narrative of what happened to your character, just within a couple actions. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts, Max, or should we just direct them to the BGG post when it goes live?
I will have that live in 5 minutes or so. So I think we can send people there. Did I have any other thoughts on this topic? Probably, usually. If they're important, they'll come back to me. The big one is just that a lot of this isn't implemented in the beta. But the real dynamic gameplay loop is you going to check out the beta, playing it, sending us feedback, and us changing the game based on the things you point out. Because we've already made some really great updates based on things people found in the beta. Really excited for the Kickstarter to launch so that we can continue to get that feedback, because that's going to be just invaluable to development. There's all sorts of little things where, like, we'll see somebody try to interpret a rule and we'll go, maybe it should work the way they thought it did, because that's actually more intuitive and better. So there's just all sorts of little things. So I guess the real dynamic gameplay loops are the friends you made along the way.
Great. Yeah, there we go. All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining in. As we'll see you next week, and have a good week this week. All right. Take care. Thanks, everybody.